Well, hello, everyone. We are so thrilled to have a chance to speak again with Nagalis and Ilana, and we have Mr. Jockin joining us as well from the Lithuanian Free Market Institute. And we had a wonderful opportunity speaking with them before on the primacy and importance of lack and how lack matters, what it can do for our thinking today, how it can actually contribute to us being more human and fuller human beings, and also how it's such a central concept that's strangely kind of been forgotten in the history of thought or left behind. Mr. Jockin, for example, we've had so many conversations about lack in Aristotle, and you would think a concept like that would not be forgotten, but alas, it has, and we think there has been significant consequences for it. And Nagalis was speaking on that as well on Aristotle and gave us a tremendous overview on the history of lack and how that relates to the metaphysics of Aristotle. And Elena, we were talking so much about lack in free markets and economics and how that really matters. And today, we thought we would talk a bit of a focus on what are more, you could say, the personal consequences of losing a connection with lack. How does it change us in our daily lives as individual persons in terms of how we are toward life, how we think about life, how we think about being a full human being, maybe even our motivation and how we get through the day? And an opening question that we thought we might explore and then see where we go is, from personal experience, what narratives on lack do people recognize more easily or find more familiar? And we thought that might be a nice angle, and then wherever the conversation goes, because it might help people see the importance of lack when they can connect it that way and to think about it. And then it has ramifications on how we might communicate and motivation. And to start, before I pass it to Nagalis, I certainly can say that a lot of people recognize the importance of scarcity and how there are things that are scarce in their life. But this almost can create a sort of frantic need to gather, to have more, to escape that scarcity. Whereas when you think about, say, lack, or that feeling of no matter what job I have, there's still something more, no matter what relationship I entered into, there's something that's missing. This is an entirely different way to think about life. And if actually one approaches that as an opportunity, Nagalis was saying before how without lack, there's no change. That's not good. There's no development. And it's funny how one mindset can be the beginning of an adventure. Who knows what could happen now? Where the other mindset might be more hopeless. And a hope of these conversations is actually to point to how lack can open a horizon of adventure. So that would be some personal thoughts of me, but I'll pass it on to Nagalis. And again, we're so glad to have everyone here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think that we should focus on the positive aspects of lack and to think about lack as an opportunity of fulfillment, because lack is never, there is no such a lack that would be absolute lack. All lack is relative, and every lack, each kind of lack opens up a possibility of fulfillment. For example, a human person may find himself or herself as an object of lack. He himself or herself can view oneself as an object of lack vis-a-vis of other people, and he may to find such a situation where he or she becomes an object of lack, instead of noticing any sort of lack which is detrimental to him or her, lack of money, of love, any other thing, he or she may find oneself in a position of find oneself as an object of lack. And this situation enables oneself to become a productive part of society, a productive member of society, and to fulfill a very meaningful function within the framework of societal framework. So we should think about lack in positive terms, and should use an algorithm, such an algorithm that we localize in the first place something positive, something valuable, and to start from the position of success story, not from negative narrative, from the position of negative narrative, but from the position of some positive achievement. For example, we may view the discovery of Americas as a consequence of some sort of lack of an alternative way to India. They had one way eastwards, and they wanted to find another alternative way to India. And they found, Columbus found an entirely new thing, the America is an entirely new thing. So when we are lacking something, there is no guarantee that we will find that very thing, but there is a possibility that we will find an entirely new thing and even more important thing. So there is reason to view every sort of lack as an incentive to find meaning in one's life, and to search for new things, for entirely new things. And we may never find what we lack, but we nevertheless may find something which is even more important and more valuable. And the same goes with literature. For example, the Roman poet Horace said that if he would have been much richer, if had he a fortune, or had he been a rich man, he would never have started writing poetry. He would never have achieved his status as a poet, and perhaps he wouldn't have written a single piece of poetry, a single poem. So we find the same algorithm in the sphere of literature and in sculpture, in the visual arts. For example, in sculpture, when we have a cube, a simple geometric figure, it is in some sort of fulfillment in terms of mass, of sheer mass, but we have to remove some parts from that cube in order to achieve that particular form. For example, to achieve the form of Michelangelo's David. So we may find something which is the, so to speak, the embodiment of fulfillment, and it may lack some greater value. And when we remove some parts from it and proceed from the point of fulfillment to the point of deficiency in terms of sheer mass, we find something of even greater value. We find that magnificent, very beautiful form for example, of Michelangelo's David or Pieta. And all lack and all fullness are relative terms. So I think it's productive to view lack as a relative term, not to focus on some one or that or few very primitive manifestations of lack, but proceed from those very simple forms of lack to those more sophisticated forms of lack that would lead to sophisticated and subtle forms of fulfillment. The same goes in the visual arts, in literature, for example, also in our daily life. Our zest for life is related to our power of motivation. Then this very word, motivation, motive, is from Latin movere, to move. And we should find in ourselves that driving force which enables us to realize ourselves. And for example, when we speak about ordinary people, one story is with those who are talented, who are geniuses, but quite another story is ordinary people, ordinary men and women. And we should think about the possibility to find fulfillment in their lives also. And I think that the realization that their life might also be meaningful may lead them to the thought that lack as such is not a bad thing. It may provide them with an opportunity to find meaning in their life. And when we realize that they may become an object of lack relative to other people, they may find a deeper meaning in their life. And so lack may become a means of this search for meaning in one's life and finding meaning in one's life. So, thank you.
I love it, finding America. I think it's longing. As Nagli said, it's not specific lack that we are lacking, but we have the longing for something which we do not know. And therefore, what we find may be much more beautiful than what we are longing for. Right?
Yeah, to circle back on the original first part, in terms of what's a narrative about lack that people can understand. Because generally, as we discussed in New York, lack is a rather obtuse topic. In fact, even drawing it out, to even talk about it, requires a lot of work for most people to understand. I'm reminded though, I'm reminded of a line from Heidegger. Really, the danger of technology, right? It's the saving power, but it's also it's the greatest danger. I think lack works in a very much a similar way. And I specifically remember something Michelle talked about many moons ago. I think it was during a group discussion about philosophy of glimpses. I think it was with the three of us, the group of us together, talking about that 2 summers ago, I believe, where Michelle made a very powerful comment that lacks are real because they act on us. And more particularly, I think a part of reality that most people in the developed world will understand very clearly is mental health. I think mental health in particular is a case where I think that's both a danger in the sense of what it causes. What I'm getting at here is that generally, when people go through mental health, have illnesses or problems in their relationships, generally that's very much the idea of distinctions between causes and catalysts are very clear. For example, your particular situation or circumstance is clearly a catalyst, but it's only through the repetitions of multiple catalysts that have the same effect that I think a general definition of mental health would be not achieving what you want, that your declared self has a certain desires and aims that you seem to self-sabotage, or you seem to constantly keep finding yourself in moments of failure. And if you just attribute it to the catalysts thinking they're causes, that's incorrect. You're not going to come to the root truth, which is probably going to be a lack of some kind. No different than, quite frankly, I use the metaphor of a physical bridge breaking down because a failure of lack of support on a certain beam. That was certainly the actual cause, but it may have been catalyzed by an overloaded car, for example, or truck. No different than in relationships or in mental health dynamics. For example, say there's a certain relationships that keep constantly failing for a person, but that's a catalyst. So each relationship's a particular event, and then maybe the particulars are all unique and different, all part of a sea of indefiniteness, right? But yet there's a somewhat, let's just say, I mean, it's interesting, the language used is the idea of, like, let's say you have a lack of a father figure as the cause of those patterns. It actually requires a kind of memory and repetition of thought to apprehend that pattern. That's the actual bounding limit on you. And more importantly, it's ruling over you. And I think so, thus drawing through, that's actually the danger of it, that you're actually being ruled over on an individual personal basis by not knowing what lack is and not realizing this pattern. That's an actual, I use that language of father figure or figure. I don't think it's accidental either, because these are phantasms in the mind. And phantasms are images that we use to think through and work through our reality. And in fact, a lot of our problems in interfacing with our relationships with ourselves, with outer world, is because of a mismatching of images. The stimulus, the circumstance given brought forth to you is not mapping up to the phantasms and images you have back in your mind. This is usually the language used as subconscious. I don't think we can even use that argument. I think it's actually better said your soul basically has certain phantasms that are using instead. And that mismatch is meaning you're in ignorance and you're actually trapped. You do not have freedom. So thus, to kind of bring up that point of what is the positive framing of lack, it is not a running away from it in the sense that we don't want to have lack. It's instead, the reality is, if we don't understand what's going on here, just like knowledge is important, because without knowledge, there's no freedom. It's the same argumentation here, I would find. I think that's actually a very powerful argument here. And in particular, to attach that up, because as we said, motivation is a very key part of all this. That relates to desire. And I think in particular, there's a very important need for distinction here, using Aquinas terms, right, of the irascible appetite, right, versus the Crocesian appetite. And I think it's really important because these kind of that distinction, especially as an artist myself and people who work in the arts, we're driven by a pain, right? Because lack has this kind of pain aspect too, right? And I'm reminded of a lot of, especially if you're a theological, if we have a religious point of view, Augustine talking about, my heart is restless, my heart rests in thee, God, because there's nothing else can satisfy that desire. No material reality can ever do that. And in the arts, we understand that there's a kind of drawing out. We need to be, it's actually a calling forth, is that what a man loves is demanding on him that he needs to draw out. And that drawing out from him to make things, to do things, to enact, is because there's something lacking. Because lack requires that's one of our major challenges too, by the way. So this first line I've talked about is this kind of mental, personal health dynamic. I think a lot of people can relate to that. Our next step is to make the argument that's not in your head, bro. Like, that's not just some kind of arbitrary inventiveness in your mind. There's a kind of, using Aquinas kind of fourth way argument, that gradation of existence, of being, and knowing that things can move towards in a way, towards fulfillment. And these things are the deepest parts of our reality, and they are ruling over us, that we get the choice to participate with, how we choose to do that. This is actual reality we're dealing with here. That these signs, that lack is basically just as if lack is an image. Every image is lacking, yet it points to a glimpse to reality. If that wasn't true, that we wouldn't be able to make reasonings or make arguments that hit the note. I'm basically quoting from Plato. on, right, that right opinion can work just as good as knowledge. If that wasn't true, we wouldn't get same outcomes. We wouldn't get actions that occur in reality.
Perhaps from Theaetetus, perhaps. Not from from Theaetetus, perhaps. The distinction between the doxa and Altes doxa and episteme.
It's both. Yeah, it's both. Yeah, you can do Theaetetus too. That's perfectly fine. But yeah, so I'm just going to close with, I think these are kind of I think that's actually the most empowering part about it, is if we can bridge this gap to show that mental health has clearly a dynamic of lack in play. And I think people who come from Lacan training would agree with that. There's a whole argument made between loss and lack and all that kind of stuff. So I think we actually, in psychotherapy circles, can certainly have a lot of people who would get on board with our arguments here. And especially on their arguments of the extended soul or self, psyche. I think especially once we move into those arguments, I think then you can make a case to point out not only is this super critical, basically the most central point is that we think freedom is somehow this ultimate virtue, that without virtue, actually itself, you don't get freedom, but that this is the thrust that justifies why we should talk about this in the first place. We will not be free until we address lack. That'd be my summary point. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your time.
Yes, I loved your mention of passion, because passion is from Latin passus and pater, and it means both desire and suffering. And suffering stands in as if in the position of lack. We are lacking when we suffer, and at the same time we have passion, because the passio is and also Greek pathos, the same meaning as passio in Latin. So passion is a form of lack, and it is also a form of a driving force of desire. That point was very, very productive. I think it was very beautifully mentioned. Thank you.
I think it's important, because I think in terms of why does this matter? Why there needs to be action requires drive. That's the whole point. This is not some intellectual discussion in and of its own sake. We have to come to realizations, but we have to be driven to make an action from it and be willing to make a commitment to it. I think these are really important qualities of maybe even courage, because that's kind of the whole pretense, is that you have to be willing to act. Lack is kind of drawing out this radical indefiniteness. In fact, that's part of why there's beauty about it. It's because it's not pre-circumscribed into a definite, clear case, but yet it does in a weird, bizarre way. Not in the particulars, but in a kind of almost like a Gaussian distribution argument. So that's the thing too. Also, I think it's also a way for us to bridge Aristotelian logic and thinking with populational thinking, quite frankly. Basically, the modes of scientific investigation, of working by probabilities. I think that's also that's a more technical kind of leeway to give grounding why lack is worthwhile.
May I make a small point? Many people would agree that they lack something, that they lack many things, but I think the challenge is to understand the universality of lack and the primordiality of lack. And here my question is whether someone without a very philosophical structure of mind is at all able to absorb the universality and the primordiality of lack. And what would be the way to help the person to get there? One way I know it's a fashion. When we are very successful and we promote the idea, many people would just follow it because it's a new trend. It's a new finding, a new America. But for a thinking man, for a challenging man, what would be the way to get there?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, Thomas.
Oh no, I would just say, I think the idea that you are not free unless we address lack. I mean, I when you present the argument like that, and I think again, especially over people's personal lives, especially with the move towards understanding mental health as being a factor of pressing point, I think that my argumentation would be that would be the strongest case you can make, that everyone desires to be happy, and to be happy is a mode of basic activity of being free, both freedom from, but freedom for. I think it's also right, and that especially that freedom of is a little more articulate, right? It's a little more definite in point, right? And then what we're also pointing out is that there's also a freedom for. We got to be oriented towards something. And the question, actually in the modern democracies, is that we don't feel so inclined to want to specify what exactly that freedom for is, per se. And lack is basically drawing out that point. There's a kind of universality of virtue, right? That everybody is going towards excellence. But the particular expression of it is actually, if we do not have, it's not oriented in lack, there is no freedom. Because then we're just prescribing, telling you exactly how to be free or how to be a certain way. And I think in the modern democracies, we've accepted that that's not permissible. But yet, as a result, we just then toss out all virtue as discussion points. I mean, that'd be more my personal interpretation at that point. But I think this restitution is probably one of the ways we're going to have to do it. Because otherwise, you're going to have to make some argumentation on, most of the time the arguments are made on pure economic grounds, right? GDP growth, things like that. Sure, no, I'm not dismissing those are great. I'd make an argument that's probably more of a freedom from privations or freedom from poverty, basically, which is good. Nothing wrong with that. But what we're talking is a little higher of a point. It's like, what's the next step after that? And I do think that lack is probably articulated the right way. And it's very difficult because we're dealing with very obtuse points. But I think and attached to freedom, I think it's probably going to be the way to do it, in my personal opinion. I'm done talking.
For now. No, that was all very good. Thank you so much. And golly, I took down so many notes. But I want to just sort of quickly speak to what Thomas was just talking about, because I think mental health is the language of our current time for motivation. Like, we don't really talk, I mean, yes, there are some kind of self-help books about motivation and things like this, but a lot of the language in current culture, and especially on social media and in the youth, is about mental health. It's about anxiety, depression, it's about, and even like you can see in there's almost a comedic position in memes and that type of exchange where people almost want to laugh about it, but it's also like this kind of dark humor in a way, because it's like, oh, it's so relatable, but like, let's laugh about it, and like that's some way to cope with the reality of how depressed we feel or how anxious we may feel, or things like this. But I think that it's really wonderful to frame it in the language of, we won't be free until we address lack, because I think about people who feel very stuck, like they feel extremely stuck, like they can't move, like thinking about Nicholas, how you were saying about motivation, motivar and mover, those are to move, and there's a lack of movement that I think people feel in this kind of sort of prison of, it's a strong word, but I do think people feel very locked in by certain figures and figments of their essentially imagination, because Daniel and I talk a lot about how memory and imagination are very related. You never really remember like some little card in a file and, oh, there's my memory from when I was making meatballs with my mom when I was 4. It's more like you imagine it. It's true, but it's also a part of your imagination, how you paint the picture of that scene, the feelings, the sensations, the smells, how you felt, how you feel about your mom too. And maybe things that have happened since can paint the picture differently or recreate it. And that's the thing, we can always create new stories and new narratives, but we don't really feel like we have that capacity with feeling stuck. And I think there's another thing where kind of the common person who's not really philosophically wanting the structure, that's not relatable for them, they feel stuck and they feel bored. And and it's very easy to, in that position, sort of just blame. It's always like the externalization of that.
And the irony is, the paradoxical thing is when you internalize that, you actually have the freedom. That's when you can start to actually have the space. That's what lack is. Like, you have the space to start to create, to start to make your own way, to start to write your own story, to rewrite your story and your past even, and move into the future in this manner. But yeah, I appreciate, Thomas, that you brought that up. I remember that conversation so well with Javier, you and me and Daniel. And I remember talking about lack is a nothing that does something to you. And that's the weird thing about it, right? It's this thing there anyway. So that's why it's so important for us to be able to readdress it, because the lack is there anyway. And if we're not aware of it, then we just have this very fixed idea of what happened to us or what it is we lack. And it's always something we can never reach. And it's basically dictating all of our lives, all of our repetitions, and our, like Thomas mentioned, our self-sabotage, which can also be a form of survival. A lot of people do that, not because they're trying to destroy themselves, but actually because they're trying to preserve themselves, right? They're trying to protect themselves, but that ends up being a form of sabotage because it's destructive, but it's often a means to self-preserve. And Daniel and I have been, we were really blessed to be able to teach a course at Parallax on Ivan Illich, and I was thinking a lot about his work as we were talking, because he talks a lot about sort of debunking the idea of scarcity as our means of looking at the world, but also there's a way in which he has ideas about disablement. Thank you, Daniel. And how, we have to sort of understand our own ability. We have to understand our own capacity. But it's strange that a lot of times lack always puts us in a place where we feel like we're not able, we're disabled. And unfortunately, a lot of times we have externalized, how I said we externalize everything, right? That's where blame can come in. That's where it's easier to do this sort of protect. Oh, that's what I was going to say. Sorry. Self-preservation. Self-preservation is good. Of course, that's why we survive and want to survive and all of these good things. But self-preservation can go to a far extreme where it crystallizes us. Like it's a self-preservation that actually contributes to our lack of movement. We don't move anymore. We don't have. And then what's strange is that when we have a lack of movement, we even lack itself. Like, we don't have the space that we can move around in, because we're so concerned with self-preservation that then we don't take risks. We don't realize that, lack is actually a very universal thing that all people experience, that failure is part of our lives, and that mistakes are part of our lives and our movement and our progression. We always see these things as like final, fixed, preserved, crystallized, and not like a chrysalis of a butterfly that's going to open, but just a hard, solid, objective rock, that's weighing people down. And I mean, I think about it personally that, I do think that religion helps a lot with the idea of the figment of our imagination, right? Like Thomas was saying, we have this figure, the father figure being absent, okay? It's a very real thing. This is not to dismiss that that's happened. It's not even to dismiss the pain and the heartache of that situation. The thing is that the reason why we want to talk about internalizing the lack is so that you can be free of that being who you are, which means you have to let go of pretty much everything you've known about yourself and your life and your father, even forgive. And then also realize that, there's actually, in a way, I have to be the father that I never had. And that gives you something to strive towards. And I know people personally who they had a very bad father figure or absent father figure. And then they said, what, I understand that he couldn't, at that point in his life, he could not be the father he really should have been. But I forgive him, and I want to be that. I want to try my best to live a life that can basically give him another chance through me as a man, right? And it's very cool to be able to have that opportunity to do something better than you were given, and to make something more out of the lack that you were given. But it's actually a potential space there for that to come forth. So anyways, I just think it's funny because knowing that the concept in Christianity of God being the father, in a way, even if you had a really bad father, you always have this sort of reliance on a heavenly father who is perfect, who is loving, and who is always there for you. And so that concept is, sure, a lot of people might say, well, that's just a figment of your imagination. Well, it's either that figment or the figment you have right now that is controlling your life, you know, and that's making you not able to do anything, and constantly repetitious in your romantic relationships and all these things. So it's like, I understand the concern, but we almost have to get more, we have to start to really be educate ourselves, and then also make a choice. Choice is made in lack, because you don't know exactly if that's the right choice or the wrong choice. You're making a leap of faith and making a choice. And a choice in a figment, I think, is maybe the best route for sort of rewriting our stories. So then we can actually say, okay, I'm going to choose my figure, my inspiration, and realize that perhaps it doesn't come in this world, but it doesn't mean it's not here for me. And it doesn't mean that it's not present for me in this present absence type of dialectic. And the last thing I'll say is that I was thinking about Finding the Americas. I love that example. And it made me think about how much children love boxes. You know, they get a box, you take out the thing, that's the thing that they're meant to play with, and they're playing with the box. You know, the empty box, they've made it into like their spaceship or whatever they want to make it out of. And I just think that's so telling. You know, it's so funny, and it's so telling that parents know kids love the boxes, and they really do. They'll play with them for days and weeks and months, compared to even the toy that filled the box. And then the other thing was, I was thinking about the Wright brothers, who, you know, were some young boys in, I think, Ohio or something, and the Wright brothers discovered flight and airplanes and all this, but they probably were just bored and didn't have anything to do. And, you know, we're probably like, hey, Wright brothers, you know, stop. Yeah, thanks, Daniel, North Carolina. And so it's like, hey, right, you know, they were probably being encouraged to stop doing that, right? But it's actually the fact that they had the lack of something to do that gave them something to do. And then in their pursuit of it, they ended up finding out about flight. And this is why we have airplanes. And this is why, you know, you guys can meet in New York, Elena and Thomas, because of the Wright brothers having, you know, they taking nothing and kind of making something out of it, you know. So those were some things that come to mind. The last thing I'll say is that I think a lot of times people who feel overwhelmed, this goes back to the mental health aspect, overwhelmed, burdened. Sometimes the weird thing is, it's not about lack. It's actually about having too much. And that's the weird thing. You have too much to do. You feel like a weight on your shoulders. What if you lack that stuff, or if you lacked the sense of urgency with everything, then maybe you would actually have the freedom and the space to write that poem you've been wanting to write, sing the song you want to sing, you know, do this. Now, I think in busy lives, you've had to find a way to sing the song while you cook. But, you know, in a sense, it's not about having too much. It's about not it is about having too much. That's in some ways the problem. And I think today in our like deluge and information overload, we have no sense of how to prioritize information, what we should do. There's so many points of access for communication that it's overwhelming. It's not a lack. It's because we have too much. We need lack so that we have the space to do the things that we are intrinsically motivated to do, and that our lack drives us to do. But then, you know, you get this scary question of, what do you actually want? And it's very hard to answer that question. That's scary, but it's actually the very question we really must sit with. So anyways, I just want to share those things. Thank you.
Well, wonderful. A few things come to mind. First, with the example of the adventure, I think that speaks a lot to how a lot of the greatest moments in life are surprises. And surprise is a testament to lack, because it has to come from something you didn't know was there that then arises. And one of the things that modern life seems to be missing is surprise, because we know too much. I also think when we think of lack as an adventure, that means there's somewhere to go. There's something to do. And I think one of the things that contributes to unhappiness is a kind of lack of motion, a kind of lack of movement with states. Some classical thinkers, maybe especially the East Orthodox side, will talk about the energies, where the universe has energies and movements. In a way, seems to be that we've lost that. The question that I think is very good on how would you get the non-philosophical person to think in terms of lack? We know it probably is possible because religions seem to have done it. I think of, say, Protestantism, talking about sin, fallenness. Many religions, maybe I don't want to say every religion because I haven't studied every religion, but there is something very there's a ability that religions had to simultaneously suggest that you were lacking, but that's actually an opening for the divine. So that seems to have worked. Is there a way to do something like that? I think what's also interesting is religions, we've been talking about the positives of lack. Religions also reminded you of the negatives of completion, isolation, finished, cut off, egotism. It sounds strange sometimes to speak of the positives of lack, but there's actually quite a lot of negatives with completion. And religions had a way of basically going, you actually know this, congregation, don't you? You know that that new job didn't bring you happiness. You know that you're secretly hiding your own insecurities. You know that you're not complete in yourself, despite what a mask you might put on. And people would go, yeah, you're right. Dang it. And it's like, well, that's because all of you actually share in lack. And notice how that was a foundation for community, purpose, tasks. Lack is very relational, and that's a key dimension. And in the first, we see evidence in sociology of a friend session. It's very wild. Recent studies show that in first world nations, I don't know about other nations, that the average person in their 50s, if you ask them, how many friends do you have? The majority say 0. Like not 1, 0. It used to be people would say 3. Now it's come down to 0. Thomas Jockin brought up the very important point on mental health. There's a weird phenomenon where it seems that first world nations have worse mental health than third world nations. Now, some people have disputed that. I think it still seems to be true that there's something about, well, not having scarcity that ironically forces you to confront the reality of lack. But in not having the language of lack, what ends up happening is people think there's something wrong with them, as opposed to saying, actually, this is a universal condition that suggests that humans are relational, that they need motion, and they need change, and they need something to compel them. I think this message is something that many people can look at, because basically other things you could do is say, hey, does it feel like the world's on fire? Most people would say yes. Now, of course, we have as human beings a tendency to look at the negative instead of the positive. We have our fear-based lizard brain, but there seems to be something to it. And if you go to people, well, the issue is that they need more stuff. Well, the first world nations seem to be on fire, or no friends, or not really relating just as much as nations that don't have wealth. And so it says, well, maybe you need wealth. I don't want to not have the access to the internet to speak with you fine people. But what's very interesting is what is Michelle mentioned Ivan Illich. What's kind of happened is we now try to address scarcity to get to pure being, if you will, as opposed to address scarcity in the context of lack. St. Augustine made a very important point that problems or evil is a disordered good, because evil is an absence of good. It's a privation. So what we actually have today is where economists talk about scarcity, but they don't talk about lack. We end up treating lack as we end up seeking scarcity to arrive at a completed state, which actually just forces people to confront lack in first world nations, but they don't have the language for it. So then they're bored. So then their mental health suffers. Then they think there's something wrong with them and they isolate themselves from others not to confront it. But what if instead we thought about scarcity as the supplies you need on your journey? Not trying to reach a state, but going, oh, if I'm going to go on a journey into lack, into transformation, I need a compass. I need skills. I need food. I need a home base. Suddenly, economic scarcity is not trying to fill a hole that actually, if we did fill, we'd be dead for all the reasons we've talked about. It becomes the allocation of resources to help people in the journey of their transformation to be fuller humans and to help facilitate the relations with other people that are possible because of the opening of lack. And so suddenly the ideas of scarcity are put in a notion of lack that turns socioeconomic activity into the incubation and navigation of a journey and ascent that without humans do not thrive. It also seems to be the case, to bring some of these thoughts to a close, that basically everything in lack, everything in life becomes a burden without lack. Emotions, you don't know what to do with them because they're complete in themselves, as opposed to emotions becoming passions that drive you onto an adventure. Emotions become something that come upon you in your room and you don't know what to do with them, so they can become a burden. Likewise, you make money, you have wealth, but you have no sense of where to invest it, only to keep it to maintain comfort. And so it gets stuck. Likewise, you don't have a sense of going out of your house. You don't have a sense of needing to go find and create. And so learning, say, the skills of the artist, learning the skills of how to speak with friends and form communities, you don't have incentive to do those things. And so then you're stuck with the burden of not having those things. And so lack, the funny thing is that lack sounds like such a dreadful thing, but I think Mr. Jockin put it very well. Without lack, we cannot be free. And worse yet, basically everything in life becomes a burden. It becomes something that's not moving. It becomes a kind of weight. And I think on this question too, of how to get people who are non-philosophical to understand it, you just ask, how many people who retire within 2 months go back to work? So many people retire and then go back to work. Why? Why would you do this? And it's like, it's not money. I remember when I was unloading trucks, how many people would retire and come back to work? And the reason wasn't money. It was, I wanted something to do. I didn't want to be at home. I wanted to see people. Work provided all of the things that community is supposed to provide, that because we don't have a universal sense of lack, the society is not creating outside of a work context. And so then people can't retire without losing all of those things they need to be fully human. And what a sad state of affairs. You know, I'm not saying that work is bad, but we should have a society where leisure is possible in the kind of classical sense of this full form of rest. The funny thing is that humans cannot rest without lack. We have to maintain, and I think that speaks to the freedom idea. We find ourselves caught either in a busyness or a boredom or an aimlessness. And lack is the way to kind of sublate the not having something to do with motion, because leisure is a rest that moves. And that is only possible with lack. And so a few things I would point to: the friend session, the fact that there's a lack of friends today in first world nations, the fact that you have mental health problems, the fact that so many people in retirement go back to work, the fact that so many people seem to have lots of wealth but aren't necessarily happy and stuck in a cycle of accumulation, the fact that people, C.S. Lewis once said that people have it's the argument of desire, that people tend to desire an object and whatever object they get isn't it, which suggests they desire something beyond the finite horizon. You start looking at all of these things, and I think you start seeing resources that speak to people's everyday lived experience that they don't need philosophy to get, that suggests something is missing from the universal picture of humanity. And funny enough, what's missing is lack. But once you understand that lack is an opening, it's an invitation into an adventure and with others, it certainly sounds like what people need. And I think speaking to that can help spread the notion of lack to more and more people so that they can find what it is to be fully human on that adventure that is being human.
I would like to elaborate on the concept of leisure, because the Greek word schole means, it is derived from the verb to have, to echo or secho, the older form. So schole means having, but neither money nor wealth nor health, but sheer time. So schole means having, and if we translate the Greek word schole, translate as leisure, then leisure is having, in the fullest sense of this word, of time, or even of what we do not know, something that we are searching for. And so if schole is a form of lack, then lack is some form of fullness, of completeness. It's a very good point. I'd like to return to the concept of and to the phenomenon of depression, because I think that if depression is not of an extreme form, if it's not a pathological depression of the most severe form, when people cannot do anything, it may be a form of sobriety, because you are not depressed if you have the normal levels of neurotransmitters, of dopamine, serotonin, and so on. And these neurotransmitters, they act as drugs, as narcotics, as internal narcotics. So normal people who feel healthy, they are addicted in some form or another to their internal drugs, narcotics. So depression, if it's not of a severest form, it's a form of sobriety, when you are detached from your illusions, when you are the grips with reality as it is, and you may think soberly, and to write, to create music and novels and poetry and so on. And most of creators, they suffered from depression, but not of perhaps of most severe depression, because when you are depressed in the most severe form, you are as vegetable, in Aristotelian, speaking in Aristotelian terms. So even depression, if it is lack of mental health, it nevertheless provides us with the appreciation of reality as it is, as some form of sobering experience. It's a very hard experience, but it enables us to create the most sublime creations of literature, of music, and so on. Just an appreciation of depression in some form.
Yeah, I really like that, Nicholas, and I think that's really helpful. And it made me think of when I was with somebody who's very close to me, who was dealing with some form of depression. But I love thinking about this as sobriety, right? And it's very sobering. It's hard, but it's like and I thought about this, actually. It's funny, before you were speaking, but then it lined up so well that it's almost the fact that they don't feel like something is right means they're still alive, and means they're on the right track. Don't give up, keep going. But I remember this moment really vividly, where this person who I'm very close with, took my shoulders, and in sort of a panic desperation said, when will I ever feel like myself again? And I remember that moment so well. And at the time I was much younger, and I didn't really know what to say, except maybe give them a hug. But in a way, it almost makes me think that you'll never feel like yourself again. That's the whole point. In a way, none of us will ever necessarily feel like ourselves if we have some sort of concrete sense of a self that's not moving. Remember that kind of self-preserved, fixed self. And it's difficult because that was what protected us for so long. So when we are realizing we don't feel like ourselves, sometimes that actually means we're starting to become the butterfly, right? We won't necessarily feel like ourselves. When we are always paying attention to that,
then we may miss the opportunity to see ourselves as actually growing, changing, learning, becoming. And I'm not trying to advocate for some sort of desperation of feeling okay, but I do think that sometimes we have to learn to become more comfortable in not feeling ourselves. And it's scary, and it feels like you're having a bit of an identity crisis, but it doesn't mean you're not yourself. It means that yourself is becoming, and so it's changing. And so therefore, perhaps even having to let go of the feeling to allow for the new feelings to come forth is important. But yeah, I just wanted to say that really quick. What you said was so good. It made me think of that as well.
I mean, to build on that, isn't there also kind of a pretense behind this discussion of lack too, on the idea of receptivity? Because Dan made that comment about being, and I think you too, Michelle, you said about frozenness, right? Kind of and actually what was just said before about the nature of depression. I mean, mental health, the dynamics of the mind are meant to make predictions on reality, right? And what happens is when there's a mismatch between the expectations for inference predictions of our mind against the reality, that difference between the two is what causes an emotion, or causes symptoms of different dynamics of different kinds. If it's an anxiety towards the future that you think you're going to get harmed, it's anxiety. It gets presented as anxiety. If it's related to basically a desired end goal of some point and it fails, it probably comes up as depression in some mode. But in both cases, the problem here, or the kind of presentation of symptom, is from a kind of lack of receptivity, in the sense that there's a concern that this entity, this prediction apparatus of the mind, is basically faltering or a crisis of some moment, right, against the realities of where they thought they were going to be, or what was going to happen under some dynamic of some kind. I bring that up too because the idea of, how lack relates to other kind of non-mental dynamics, like, for example, receptivity and beauty and generosity, for example. I mean, these ideas of being receptive to reality, like that example before about Michelangelo's stone, right? Artists will talk a lot about responding to the material, to the granite, to the wood. Is that artistic expressions? As an artist, I'll tell you, that's not necessarily true. We definitely, obviously, are imposing something onto the material because we're drawing forth, right, a figure out of this material, the material. But we certainly are aware of the responsiveness and the kind of receptivity of that material with us, in the sense that, a very basic example, like in wood, there's a grain to wood. You have to cut it a certain way, not another. And I don't care how much you want to put it in a certain position on it. You have to be receptive to those dynamics. And in general, I would argue beauty usually almost always has that nature to it. It has a certain quality of receptivity to the particulars it presents itself in. This is why language like fittingness comes in very usefully in this case, which lack kind of really does have a very similar behavior. This is not going to work. Lack especially kind of demands on us a kind of refute. We both have absolute control, but we also don't have control. It's this kind of interesting state because, right, it kind of relates to the idea of prudence, right? It's a kind of in the situationness of a certain circumstance, one must be responsive to it. And all the arts deal with that. Medicine deals with that. Anything that deals with any particularity of this moment, of this place, at this time, has to be a response to a particular circumstance that's out of the control of the individual. Yet, nevertheless, that individual has a power of choice in that moment. So Daniel brings it up before about how, like, and I brought, I think, before this choice of how we respond to lack, right? And we see it in the arts, we see it in how we heal our lives, in our mental health, and in our relationships with other people too, by the way. I think it's actually a huge aspect of this too. Because acts of charity and generosity absolutely require very similar behavior. And in fact, maybe even more so, because a pure economic exchange of equivalence is no gift at all. There's something very different about the kind of properties of what a gift is, and the behaviors that are gifts. And generally in the theological traditions, they would generally say that the soul is beautiful when they enact acts of charity, for example. That's why I'm bringing this up too. It's like this is a more, again, the idea of how could this relate to other people. I think also a big part is the idea of kind of what Michelle said too, of people's willingness to be flexible, to be responsive, a kind of receptivity to being proactive to reality, you know, and this is what we're kind of getting at here, is that a kind of that's in contrast to, I'm gonna draw one that's in contrast to a prescriptive, preset, expected, fitting model that everything has to fit within, that reality has to fit within a certain prescribed notion or imposed, that everything must respond to. Nothing beautiful will come from that, and absolutely nothing of generosity comes from that. And it actually makes things more fragile. I'm quoting the scene to left and things like that. Usually when receptivity of variables are not permitted within a system, and you're trying to smooth that whole variation to get a predictable outcome, that ends up causing gigantic explosions of uncertainty somewhere down the road instead. So what you thought was a short-term fix, it's actually hydrogenics, basically. A short-term known fix or intervention gets a small known outcome, but that monstrous, uncertain, nasty harm down the road. Examples like in medicine, for example, like things that help women with basically morning sickness from pregnancy, ends up causing birth defects down the road, for example, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm trying to draw forth other modes besides mental health, which is, I think, is definitely one of the most key ones to do. But there's other modes too, where our lack of understanding of lack, basically our ignorance of lack, let's put it that way, is very much detrimental. So I think even engaging in the modern world in a way that's effective.
If I may, as I listen to all of this beautiful explanation on the role of lack, I think how timely our findings are for the humanity, since people still are blind to see the beauty of lack and the great value of lack. And the most developed societies are so eager to have full completion, and they do not listen to Naglis, who says about the negative sides of the completion. So they go as a butterflies on the fire to implement all kinds of security protection, so there is no risk, no move, no friends, nothing. And you were speaking about leisure, and I was just in a conference where one of the speakers from Germany said that in Germany they already introduced from this summer some cultural cards. So the young people, when they get those cultural cards, they will get 200 euro every month for free, so that they could have some leisure, so that they could have some motivation to consume culture. So and people seem to be very favorable to these signs. So what is the way to communicate the beauty of lack and the dangers of completion? Because I think the world was never so close to the willingness and also to some capacities to introduce this completion.
I'd like to return to this point of relation, because, for example, when we think about aesthetic experiences, we may find subtle differences of appreciation of and of experiencing of what is large, big, awesome. For example, when we stand in front of a magnificent mountain, we are dwarfed by this mountain. We feel very, very small, but we are enhanced by this experience of that magnificent mountain. We feel that we are becoming much larger in a spiritual sense in front of this magnificent and very, very large mountain. And another example, when we are, for example, before or in front, before a dictator or a very savage person, we feel humiliated. So in one, the first example is related to the sense of sublime humility and enhancement, aesthetic enhancement. And the other example is related to the feeling of humiliation. Humiliation when we are feeling diminished as persons. So these relations are very different. And there are forms of lack or lacks which humiliate us, diminish us. And there are other lacks that, in spite of being genuine lacks, they enhance us, and we feel this humility, which is at the same time very, very sublime, very, very aesthetic, provide us with a sense of magnificence, of beauty, with a sense of divine. For example, when we are praying, when we are in front of a divine person, we are infinitely dwarfed in front of this person. We are nothing, and God is everything. He is infinity. And we are at the same time, we feel as enhanced. We feel much better, much larger in relation to our other, or in comparison with our other experiences when we are not praying. So there are forms of lack which provide us with a sense of divine or cosmic magnificence, and the donators donate the feeling of what is much larger than we are ourselves. Provide us with a sense of being part of what is large and more beautiful and more magnificent than we are ourselves. So this aspect of relation is very important, because there are many different forms of this relationship. It's a very productive concept.
Well, I'll note as we come up on the last 10 or so minutes, because this has been a real treat. It's tragic that these conversations have to end because of the tyranny of the clock. On that last point, to quickly note, humans seek the power to behold, not to dominate. But you have to have lack to know that that's the point of power and ability, to be able to handle the beholding, which makes me think of Mr. Jockin's work on beauty that he's been doing so much on, or the image at the end of Dante with the beatific vision. One has to go through a lot of work to go through the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and then stand before the Paradiso. But what has happened is without the doctrine of lack, we don't know what we're working for. We think it's to have dominance, to be God, basically, to be the ground of being. And so the doctrine of lack can rightly order the reason why we seek to gain money, to gain power, to gain ability. It's ultimately to be able to handle the experience of the sublime, to handle the experience of that which dwarfs us. And so in lack, you see the possibility of striving without egotism, the possibility of striving for the sake to be conditioned for a beholding. But without lack, that category of possibility is not possible. So the stakes are quite high. I think also of Michelle's example of the box. And of course, a box is a lovely example of lack because there's nothing in it, but it's not nothing. It's a box. And it's important to realize is that you either in life learn to play with the box or you will be boxed, which brings Thomas Jockin's point to mind on limits. Lack is where you can step outside the box and play with the box. Not having lack means you're in a box, you just don't know it. And so lack is the ability, there is no possibility of thinking outside the box without lack. All there is basically propaganda to convince you you're thinking outside the box when you are not. So the stakes are very high. I think also on the point of money, giving people money so that they have leisure, no amount of money will make a soul beautiful per se. No amount of money will necessarily condition a person to be ready to behold the beautiful. They need those ideas before they receive the money. Now, with money, you can then use it to think outside the box, to condition yourself to behold the beautiful. The issue is that without lack, all money can do is move us inside the box that we don't know we're in, or fail to make us think that we're conditioned when all we do is actually not move to being capable of beholding. The fate of money is tied to the fate of the ideas we have when we receive the money. This does not mean money is bad, but it means that the ontology of lack really seems to be what is necessary in this moment of economic history for what Hegel would call a sublation. We've gone through a kind of history of an emphasis on scarcity. In Hegel, you never leave that behind, but you have to then elevate lack as distinct from scarcity and scarcity included in lack, but lack addressing the things of, say, sloth, boredom. So we're at a kind of moment in history of needing that sublation, and lack is that sublation. And then we would have those two enact. And some closing points before I pass it on to everyone. What on this question of how you would get average people or non-philosophical people to understand it, it's almost like you need basically a kind of syllogism. I'm thinking of the pastors speaking with the congregation. Well, you look out and you go, do y'all feel perfect? Do y'all feel like y'all have everything you need in life? Most people would go probably no. You say, okay. Do you think what you need is more stuff? And someone might say, well, I need running water. Okay, well, we'll get you running water. That's clear. You do need that. But after that, if we've taken care of the running water, are we good? Most people will be like, nah, something's still off. You go, well, that's kind of weird, right? How can you have everything you need and still have that offness? What if there's something more to reality than we thought? That would also mean that there's nothing wrong with you, Fred. There's nothing wrong with you, Sam. You're not alone in that feeling. Actually, everyone in this congregation has that feeling. And what if that's because there is a reality of lack that we can experience it as an opening to possibility if we come together to face it? Oh, and by the way, everyone, if we don't believe in lack, then we're all going to be missing something that the only way to get is to say either get the money to get it, strive for the position, which of course probably means only a few people will get it at the end, or we're going to become reliant on some sort of dictator or power structure to give it to us. Lack empowers. Where you don't have lack, you're probably going to turn to someone to provide for you, and boy howdy, there will always be a strong man that can promise that, or you're going to be seeking a position that turns out to be an illusion of completeness, and then you just fall back into the original position. And so the doctrine of lack as a universal can actually make people less vulnerable to manipulation, create a basis of community, and create an opening of creativity. That if you present to people that way, well, that seems like we need to take this stuff seriously. And so hopefully we can continue that. But let me pass it to people as we come up on the close.
I just want to jump in really quick and with a final comment. That was really great, Daniel, and everyone. It's been a joy to hear from you all. Always a pleasure. I was thinking about behold and how it makes me think of how we forget the being, and the be in behold, we just really want to hold, we want, I have this like analogy I always like to talk about with the bird and the man. And, when you see a man with a bird that is clutching and it's trying to flap its wings and trying to get away from that man, you don't think they have a relationship, right? You don't think that bird is the man's bird, right? No, it's not the man's bird. He wants to get away from him. But if you see a man who's standing there and the bird lands on his shoulder and it goes away, it flies away. Then sometime later, the bird comes back and lands on his shoulder. Who really has the bird? Really? Who gets to hold the bird? And so for me, it's really a poignant example of how sometimes the things that make us feel most held, we feel held when we behold. But that means we are not always possessing anything, really. That we don't possess anything. And yet that's exactly when we feel most held, when we behold that which we cannot even touch. And so, to me, I think it's important to think about that relationship, because I think a lot of times why we avoid lack is because we want to feel seen, we want to feel complete, we want to feel better, we want to feel better. But really, we will feel so held in our ability to behold the divine, behold the potential, behold ourselves, and have a respect for our own essentially divinity within ourselves that is trying to come forth into the world. And that bird who lands, and the man can have him in his hand, but he can also let it go. And that relationship is that openness to the coming and the going and the movement that then is the beautiful potential for being and for being held. So anyways, I just wanted to say that really quickly.
So many beautiful narratives from very elevated people. So I think I should start experimenting with people when I go out with the less elevated people, to see what narratives they can really recognize. Mm-hmm. And of course, for everyone, it is natural to understand that we have this relationship with lack, because if we are an aim-seeking creatures, it means, it presupposes that I should be lacking something in order to want something, to wish something. And this is good. This is good structure of our neuron system. So to start understanding what people can see as natural in them and what they can accept as an excess, which is a result of not knowing this natural relation with lack. Also these elevated narratives, they are so inspiring and so reassuring. And what is great, my dear fellows, is that we are in a very passionate condition of lacking completion of our own mission. And we are people who do not lack move, who do not lack focus. So this is a great insight from our conversation today.
I love that, Elena. And Mr. Jockin, if you have any final thoughts, no pressure at all. I really like that idea that we've seen it, and it makes me think of the relevance possibly of beauty on a larger scale, and how that might be part of this puzzle. But Mr. Jockin, please.
No, I think everybody covered these well said notes in the end. I think my only comment, basically, I mean, I get it. It's amazing what happens when we bring people together with a common understanding. You'd be amazed what happens, right? And I think the very much these kind of conversations is would we not agree that this is probably one of the best outcomes of the internet? Yeah. Right? This thing that had very clearly no definite end was not it's not like when the internet got invented that this was going to happen. But it certainly was the prerequisite for it to occur. This would never have occurred without those resources or opportunities in the first place. But at the same time, it did require a current cultivation. Daniel, and by the way, your summary of my project with Plato is outstanding, because that if you had to summarize the basic takeaway from it, the dialogue series is absolutely that. We must attune ourselves to be a kind of soul, to be receptive to what's possible in the first place. And the measure is demonstrated by what we do together. And I think one of the greatest, I sent a Thanksgiving note to Daniel and everybody else I knew from a philosophical point of view. I met this last 2 years. Probably one of the greatest blessings of my life has been these friendships, bounded in basic, Aristotle would agree, perfect virtue. I think those are the most giving, the most blessed, and the most significant of my life. So, and because it's not like I get to have the kind of conversation with most people. Most of the life is utilitarian based or other kind of relationships. These are a very different kind, very rare, and very precious because of that. There's something made more by us having this dialogue together and these kind of commitments to one another, for the love of the truth. No, at the minimum, if not beauty itself, at least at the topic I have a close endearment to. So I'll close with that.
That is excellent. And I think friendship, beauty, these are parts of the puzzle of the narrative that I think are important to emphasize, and how lack can bring all of these things up. And I think, we didn't know that we were lacking this friendship until we met. And that is a testament to where lack can bring you on an adventure, and you discover something you didn't know you were going to discover, like the Americans, like America. So lack can lead you to friendship. So we would encourage everyone to live toward lack today and see what opens up. Thank you so much, everyone, for this wonderful conversation. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
All the
much.
best.